Okay, thanks for coming. I'm Hilary, this is Sian, and you can see what we're going to be talking about. Essentially, it's English medium instruction, and we're sort of taking these as basic assumptions that everybody shares, that we know that there's a rise in English medium instruction around the world, but we suspect, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone thinks differently about this, but we suspect that the amount of the rise in EAP support for lecturers and for students has not risen alongside the rise in English medium instruction. That there's a shortfall in it, perhaps particularly for lecturers. And a lot of lecturers who are now delivering lectures in the medium of English previously taught in their first language and have not had any proper training in the transfer over. In fact, we hear of cases where people almost overnight have been required to move from delivering their lectures in their first language to delivering their lectures in English without any proper explanation of what this entails. And on top of that, what lectures are actually for is going through a bit of a crisis. The lecture itself is going through a bit of a crisis. I mean, we hear all the time about flipped classrooms and so on, interactivity. If you look in the lecture development literature, it's all about not giving lectures or sort of cutting your lectures down and giving, 5 minutes and then 5 minutes talking time and so on. But in practice, if you go out into institutions, you find that the lecture is very much alive and kicking, and in most disciplines, it's still the main means of communication between staff and students, and it's very, very prominent. So there's a sort of mismatch between what the literature says about how we should be delivering academic content and what actually happens. I think there's a lot of people aren't really clear about why. A lot of lecturers aren't clear about why they give lectures. What is the relationship between a lecture and a textbook and a podcast and slides on Moodle and seminars? It's not made clear, and so either to staff or students. So in that context, we'll be looking. I'll just give a quick overview of the prior research on lecture discourse. It seems to fall into these categories of looking at micromarkers, macromarkers, macrostructure, and what we've been doing, which is looking at pragmatic features. The problem, as it seems to be universal with applied linguistics research, is that you've got lots of individuals in different parts of the world doing similar research, naming having systems of classification which are overlap, but using different terminology. It's very difficult for researchers, because you get all these lists of different classes of things and you think, well, they're almost the same, but they're not quite the same. We don't build on each other's research as they would do in the sciences. But at the same time, the model in the social sciences is to look at somebody else's research and dispute it and build up another model. What we seem to be doing in applied linguistics, EAP, is running lots of parallel pieces of research which are not knocking each other, but which don't mesh together very easily either. Which is just very, very difficult to get your head round how they relate, how these pieces of research relate to one another. So if we just have a quick look at micromarkers, I don't know if Katrine is here, Deroy, and I don't know how she would, whether you feel that your research fits into the micromarkers category, but essentially small pieces of you can tell me afterwards, Katrine, or after the it's looking at small pieces of language within lectures, which clearly serve a purpose in orienting the student, but they're not larger chunks, words and phrases. And there's been quite a lot. I think probably there's been more research on this aspect of lectures than on any other. There's quite a lot of publications which have picked out the words and phrases and said these are important for students to know. We've got macro markers, which are signals, meta-statements about the major propositions within the lecture or important transition points. So they're looking more at words and phrases which mark a change in the structure of the lecture. So the idea is that students are taught to look out for phrases which indicate a change in topic or a change in stage in the lecture. And then we've got some, but very, very little work on how lectures are actually constructed. We know really only 2 pieces of work that have looked at this in any detail, and they're not very satisfactory in actual fact. So the young, this is the one that gets quoted all the time. It comes in the Flowerdew edited collection on academic listening. It's old now, 1994. Young identified these 6 phases of the lecture. So you've got the meta-discourse phase, where you're talking about what's going to be said in the lecture or what has been said. Then there's the interaction phase, the kind of thing that I think Catherine was talking about in the plenary yesterday, where direct questions and so on within the lecture to try and interact with the audience. And the content phase, with theory and examples. So that content part is the part that we would associate most with other academic materials, like textbooks. That's the meat, that's the information part, but there's other things going on in the lecture as well, which is what we're interested in, actually. Other bits that you don't get in textbooks. So the phases are not in any particular order. She came to that conclusion that a lecture does not have an overarching structure. It's just within a lecture you get phases of interaction, phases of meta-discourse, and phases of content. So they recur discontinuously throughout the language event, and they recur interspersed with others, interweaving of threads and so on. So it's not quite the same as genre analysis in other genres, where you can predict a certain order to the phases. It's all a bit of a muddle. And then there's another researcher whose work was very interesting, but has not been picked up on at all. Very, very few references to this. Goes back to 1975, and he saw Straker Cook took Sinclair and Coulthard's classroom. Those of you who know about classroom interaction, the idea of dividing the lesson into phases. So the idea is that there's a lecture. Within lectures, there are expositions of these kinds, and within expositions there can be episodes, and within episodes there can be moves, and so you're getting a narrower and narrower description of what's going on in the lecture, and within the moves you've got acts. It hasn't been picked up on, and maybe that's because it sort of misses the point in a way. It's not actually talking about it doesn't really get down to what lecturers are actually doing in lectures. There's some overlap with the micro markers, and there's some overlap with Young's metadiscoursal phase. For instance, meta-statements would be part of Young's metadiscoursal phase. But as I say, these things haven't been meshed together, so it's really difficult to get a grip on what our understanding of lectures is actually like. We are interested in the meaning, what meanings are made in lectures, and we only know of one other piece of research that has actually looked at this in any detail, and that's Maynard and Leica working with my case lectures, and they didn't mark up my case, but they did in the My Case handbook, there are indications of which of these features occur in which lectures. So they're saying that within a lecture, you can have these events. You can have advice, you can have assigning a homework, you can have definitions, you can have directives, disagreement, evaluation, introductory roadmap, which is telling students what's going to happen in the lecture, narratives, questions, requests, speaker introductions, and tangents. So you can see here there's a bit of an overlap with Straker-Cook's acts. There's a bit of an overlap with Young's meta-discourse phase. But the two large lecture corpora are not properly annotated for pragmatic features. They're not by pragmatic features, we really sort of need functions. They're not functionally annotated. There's lots of reasons for this. A lot of corpus analysts don't like that kind of annotation because it's subjective. In the end, you know, it's a personal decision what you think the lecturer is doing. So there's resistance to it because, but on the other hand, it's terribly useful, especially if you're going to design materials, to actually work out what is the lecturer doing at this point. Why are they saying this? So we've got a pilot engineering lecture corpus at the moment, which is a collection of lectures. They're all in engineering because they're from different parts of the world, and we thought about doing multiple disciplines, but then doing multiple disciplines and different parts of the world, it becomes very, you know, it's a huge project. So we thought we'd focus on one discipline, but pick up lectures at a similar level on similar topics from different parts of the world, and then compare them and see, well, what are lecturers doing in different countries when they're talking about the same topic to the same sort of students, the same level of students. Are there differences in what they think lectures are for and how they realise various functions? Because this has implications not just for lecturer training, but also for students who are moving in any direction, British students moving to other parts of the world and students from other parts of the world moving to Britain. You know, if they have a different understanding of what the lecture is about or why they should be attending lectures, that's going to affect their how well they learn. So we know that there are differences and similarities in lecturing styles and functional distributions in different parts of the world, and we can speculate about why this is the case. We think it's something to do with the role of the lecturer, how the relationship between the lecturer and the students. We think it's you know, power differentials, and we think it's something about what kind of experience the lecturer has, whether they've had professional experience or purely academic experience, and also, of course, if they are lecturing in a language other than their own, does that affect the way that they deliver the lecture, or what they leave in and what they leave out. Catherine Walters mentioned about podcasts yesterday and said that there was fewer interactions in the non-native speaker podcast. Of course, the problem with that is podcasts are not lectures. You know, and there's an awful lot of generalizations in EAP where it's assumed just because it's an oral mode of delivery that it must be the same. But TED Talks are not the same as lectures. Visiting speakers are not the same as lectures. Podcasts are not. They're all different genres. Anyway, I think off you go, Sian.
Yeah, so the corpus. Yeah, it's a pilot study, as Hilary said. And to date, we've got 500,000 tokens. It's all within engineering, civil, mechanical, electrical. It is mostly civil and mechanical, actually. The lectures that we'll be talking about today are the top 3. So we've got some 30 from Coventry University, UK, 16 from University of Technology in Malaysia, and 28 from Auckland University. What we did was we videoed the lectures, transcribed them. They've been marked up in XML in a TEI compliant way, and we're calling that markup. And then the pragmatic annotation that we've added, well, or the pragmatic tags we're calling annotation, because we're going to put that on a separate layer eventually so that it's not combined with the more kind of structural markup. The categories that we encoded, going back to all the categories we've been talking about before, we were looking for categories for chunks that recurred across large numbers of the transcripts and things that are less likely to be found in other types of discourse, so textbooks and seminars. Today, we have these 5 categories. So we've got explaining, housekeeping, humour and its various, we've got 9 subtypes now. This was a bottom-up process of cycling through and refining this. Storytelling and summarising. We won't be talking about explaining today because actually we found that falls more into the content side of things, where we want to look at what's really going on outside the content. So I'll be giving examples from storytelling and summarising. But to give you an idea of how much of these other things are going on in the corpus, this picture here, we've got on the x-axis lecture duration. It's normalised in terms of tokens because at the moment we've not timestamped. And on the y, we've got all the lectures. If you can see 3 bands, I don't know how the contrasts come out, but this is New Zealand, this is from Malaysia, and this is from the UK. The colours should be fairly self-evident. And these are just showing the distribution and duration of where these functions are occurring. And the point, I think, from this kind of quick glance at it, is that there is an awful lot of the lectures that's made up of these functions. For example, summary, so the green chunks, and we do have 4 subtypes of summary, it's 10%. And I think that's quite an important finding of this. And what do we think the lecturers are doing? Actually, if I just go back for a second, the types of summary that we've got here are reviewing the previous lecture, reviewing the current lecture, previewing the current lecture, and previewing future lectures. So we've got 4 types, and on here they're just all green. And what do we think they're doing in these summarising? Well, they're repeating key points. Particularly, and we are looking at engineering lectures, and I think it's particularly important there, they're building concepts incrementally. Particularly with the reviewing previous and previewing future lectures, they're linking within, well, also within the lecture, but in the series. And they're activating schemata in advance. I don't know if you...
I was going to say something about Catherine Walters saying you don't need to activate schemata, but we think that you do.
We think you do. So if we have a look in a little bit more detail at summaries, and this time the different colours denote the different types of summary, what have we got? Well, one of the kind of at-a-glance findings is that there's a lot more summarising going on in the lectures from New Zealand. Well, a lot more of the reviewing current, previewing current, and looking to the future. We can speculate, you know, this could be to do with the rigidness of what they have to teach. Of the syllabus, of time not being allowed for kind of going off on tangents and exploring different concepts, whereas possibly that's occurring slightly more in the UK lectures. Again, we've got 13% in the New Zealand subcorpus comprises some type of summary. That's quite a big number. Lots of other speculations about this as well. But if we move on to story, what do we think that story's doing in these lectures? Well, it's definitely, particularly when we're talking about narratives, it's giving the students experience of real world problems. A lot of the lecturers are relaying, well, I'll come back to this, but their experience of the field. And it's also very much so in different types of story genre, modelling professional behaviour in these real-world contexts, how to react when something goes wrong, how to deal with people. It's is an important part. And tied into all this, it's creating a sense of membership in the discourse community. We've got 5 minutes left, by the way. Should I skip through? It's also reinforcing engineering theory. Less so. These parts that are not the content delivery, they do give some information about theoretical things, but that's less of the thrust of what they're doing, certainly. and they do entertain, again, possibly less so than modelling expert behaviour. We started just looking at, coming back to our categories and kind of building them bottom up, we started just looking at narratives, but found that wasn't really capturing, from a Lebovian point of view, narratives that are resolved. That wasn't exactly capturing these chunks of story that we were finding. So we split it down into 4 genres, which you can follow the flow diagram. So that allows for stories that are not resolved or are not problematized. So if we have a quick look at the distribution, what do we find? We've got recounts, more common in the Malaysian lectures. Narratives are also more common in the Malaysian, but it's actually a slightly skewed data because it's this one lecture here where the lecturer is talking about a series of videos, so that's skewed the data slightly. Some interesting things that we found was that, that there was this higher reliance on these short bursts, as you can kind of see, of narratives and short bursts of exemplar in the Malaysian lectures, whereas in the UK lectures they're relying a lot more on narratives, and especially narratives of personal experience, where they're really relying, a lot of the UK lecturers come from industry as opposed to the Malaysian colleagues. They're really relying on telling stories about, well, on this site this happened, or I made this mistake, which we think is possibly a difference in approach to interaction with students. So I will hand back over now to your final bit.
Very quickly then, because it's about to, we've hardly got any time, have we? So just when we look at advice for lecturers, there's not a great deal of advice it seems to be available for how lecturers should deliver lectures. We've got something from the HEA here, which is specifically for non-native speakers, but it does focus on macro markers and summaries. This is the kind of advice that is given. So they say, oh, well, you have to have summaries, you have to structure your lecture, you have to signal moves between lectures. I mean, it's good advice, but we think that perhaps the first step is to consider the purpose of the lecture and their own roles. Why are they giving these lectures in the first place? What, you know, is it just to deliver content, which is sort of a popular understanding of what lectures are for, or is it to model behaviour and to develop a sense of discourse community and other, you know, activate future thinking and so on. So what do the lecturers want to achieve, and what are the differences between a lecture and the other teaching tools that are available to them? I mean, trying to differentiate better between what a lecture does and what other types of instructional discourse do. And then you can use lectures to their best advantage, you know, rather than trying to replicate in a lecture what you can find in a textbook. I mean, why give in a lecture what you could read in a textbook? It's much more efficient to just send people to the textbook. And how are these affected by the medium, the relationships between participants? Those are the kind of things that we think lecturers and students ought to be thinking about. Different genres have different purposes, different pragmatic features, and we should be building on that. And things like the relationship, power, distance, academic role, professional role in relation to the relationships between lecturer and student. So, for materials, multiple authentic examples, descriptions of the lexicogrammar associated with each of these pragmatic features, what we need to supply. Contextualizations of each function. Where in the lecture do these things appear, and why do they appear there, not somewhere else? Why are we having these combinations of things occurring in the lecture? But we're not trying to say that there's one right way. You know, the idea of this project is that every culture's way of giving lectures is equally valid. It's just raising awareness of the differences between them. So those are the references. And that's it.